Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're dialing in from any point in the world. My name is Kamal Tamawa. I work with the GSMA, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar on cross-border data flows and IoT, with a specific focus on looking into the opportunities that may exist for Africa. We have a great lineup of speakers today, and starting us off will be Akinwale Goodluck, who is the head of region for Sub-Saharan Africa at the GSMA, and Wale will be giving us some brief opening remarks. Wale?
Thank you very much, Kamal, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for making the time to join us this morning. Let me welcome all of you again to this GSMA webinar, in which we'll be exploring several interrelated themes around data protection, cross-border data flows, trade and transformative technologies such as IoT and 5G that are all crucial to Africa's future prosperity. Ever since the pioneering days of the OAU and now the African Union, the journey towards Pan-Africanism, both on a political and an economic perspective, has been slow and challenging at times, but progress has been made in the last 2-3 years. And with the successful adoption of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement by all African countries, I think, except for one, the agreement kicked off officially on the 1st of January this year. It's not Uhuru yet. We still expect that there will be some challenges around implementation. Some of the implementation will be tiered depending on different countries and the industries that they need to protect. But we are confident that Africa is indeed in the right direction. We also know that economies in which goods and services are traded are underpinned by technology and data. And we mean that data that can drive better decision making, data that needs to be available, and data that needs to be protected so that people's privacy and human rights are protected. At the very same time, as we are reaching out to each other across the continent to seize the data opportunity, there are those who would advocate data localization restrictions to keep data within countries. So as we carry out our journey towards an integrated continent, and who knows, maybe one day a single digital market, this webinar will ask, why are data flows necessary? How can we facilitate cross-border data flows in Africa in a way that protects people's privacy, respects human rights, but enables us to achieve our objectives of One Africa? And then what happens when countries impose localization restrictions? What is the impact for us as Africa, for our economy, for our people, for the movement of goods, services, and people? These are all the questions that we will hope that this webinar will shed some light on and will answer. So on that note, I say thank you very much and hand over to Kamal.
For those fantastic remarks. We will be trying to make this webinar as interactive as possible. Unfortunately, because of this new normal, and we can't see you, and you can't see us in person as well, and we can't have the level of interaction that we normally would have had if we were doing this in person. We usually will have to find some ways to get people quite involved in the discussions. We will be running 2 polls whilst the webinar is ongoing. So there's a series of icons on the right-hand side of your screen. The last one at the bottom being Q&A. Please feel free to post any questions that you may have during the presentations or the discussions in the Q&A session, and in the final session when we're having the panel discussion, we'll be able to take some of those. And then right above that icon, there's an icon for polls. We've just posted the first polls. We'll be interested to know what your thoughts are around how true these. There's 2 statements that we've posted on there, and would like to know what your thoughts are around which of these statements is most important. So, cross-border data flows, should they be allowed as much as possible, or should they be tightly controlled? What are your thoughts? Now, whilst you're reading the poll and providing your feedback, I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Caroline Mbugua. Caroline is a senior policy manager with the Sub-Saharan Africa policy team. She's based out of Nairobi, had a career with Safaricom before joining the GSMA early in 2020. And Caroline will be making a presentation today on cross-border data flows and the impact of data localization. Caroline?
Thank you very much, Kamal, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I look forward to, a very engaging webinar ahead of us. So I'll start as often. If you can move to the next slide. As Wale just mentioned, 1st of January this year, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area came into being. And one can say that it's a crucial milestone, signaling that we are on the path to Pan-African integration with aspirations to improve economies and, more importantly, the fortunes of ordinary citizens across the entire continent. Although competition between countries continues to and will continue to be, a key thing that we continue to observe, this marks a decisive shift in perception towards seeing the whole of Africa as a trading bloc, and African governments and indeed the people of Africa recognizing that we are stronger together. So free trade primarily is concerned with the terminating of tariffs and custom duties for goods and services, but increasingly plays a role to stimulate and facilitate the flow of data. Data in the 21st century, as we all know, underpins not just the digital economy or the digital, but of course the entire economy. And data-driven strategies that leverage insights from data can drive better decision making, whether at a level of an individual in terms of an individual business, an economy when you're talking about a country, or of course the entire of Africa. So when looking to make decisions, data is normally very key to facilitating these decisions. And there's a reason, after all, why recent big trade deals such as the RCEP that we saw, where there are 14 countries including China, and the EU-Japan trade deal, which was accompanied by an agreement that each country's data protection laws offered an adequate level of protection to facilitate this particular growth. So we see more and more of these trading blocs coming together, and of course having a key focus on data in these particular trades. While trade deals and governments, and we are talking about maybe financial ministries, the economic advantage of data flow, and they also acknowledge that data flows can only work if we strive for a common high level of data protection and respect for human rights. And this is equivalent wherever the data goes. So we are all in agreement that it's important for us to agree on responsible ways of handling data, and of course harmonized way of handling this data. And this in turn requires a widespread adoption, development and adoption of data protection laws that grant strong rights to individuals, allowing them to understand and control what happens to their data, because at the end of the day, the individuals are the true owners of their data, and of course impose duties on companies and governments to use data lawfully and mitigate risks, and set up independent data protection authorities with sufficient powers and resources to encourage good practice, enforce the law, and cooperate with each other, especially in this era where we are looking at cross-border trade. Just to mention that if you'd like to know more about what it takes to develop a good data protection law or implement one, we as the GSMA produced a report in 2019 called Smart Data Privacy Laws that provides some guiding principles that would be a good reference point when developing these particular instruments that are key in the times that we find ourselves in. So if you look at, and if you move to the next slide, so when you're talking about this high level of protection that promotes trust and helps consumers to embrace new services and technology, and when aligned across geographies, allow data to travel. Indeed, the benefit of cross-border data flows are well understood, and some of them are, of course, individuals stay connected to a wealth of knowledge and learning, and businesses can leverage cloud services and expertise. Big data analytics and AI can leverage data sets, sorts from multiple countries. So different countries are able to provide their expertise in this big economy that we end up developing. And of course, better insights, better decisions for the economy, as I had mentioned earlier, that will be better for the society. But even with this in mind, and especially in the sub-Saharan Africa region, we still continue to see a strong appetite for data localization requirements. And this normally either force certain types of data to be kept in a country or insist on using local providers or computing facilities. This is particularly relevant to the telecom sector, where geographic restrictions on subscriber data as well as restrictions on what mobile operators can and cannot do with metadata are quite common. In our 2018 report that is called Cross-Border Data Flows, Realizing Benefits of Removing Barriers, we provided a qualitative view of benefits of cross-border data flows and the reasons used by governments to justify data localization requirements. And these are normally ranging from national security and, of course, economic reasons. But what we really needed to do is to review some hard facts and figures that would be key to be able to continue changing this mindset in the region. And so one of the things that we'd like to present to you today is a report that GSMA teamed up with an economist to develop this particular resource and see if we could come up with something tangible in the context of IoT and the results of this study that we are launching today. In the study, we look at IoT in different countries in emerging markets, and these countries are Indonesia, South Africa, and Brazil. And I believe this particular report that I'm referring to, which is what you're seeing on this particular presentation, will be available on our website, and we can post a link of this report so that you can go and read a bit more on it. So when you talk about the focus, as I mentioned, Indonesia and South Africa and Brazil, 3 countries from different parts of the world with very different economic structures. For example, Brazil is very export-oriented. And first, we start by estimating that the expected total factor productivity gains from IoT from each country using data from GSMA Intelligence 2019, and adjusting, of course, for IoT adoption rate. The shares of business in the economy that is using the technology and the sectoral contribution to the total value add. And secondly, IoT does not just impact the productivity of the domestic economy. And this is one area I'd like us to just have a bit more time to focus on. The use of connectivity, including IoT, also facilitates trade, investment, and other cross-border economic activities. And using a global trade model developed by WTO, our study assesses the reduction in trade costs and the results of e-commerce and broadband connectivity. And thirdly, we examine how hypothetical data localization restrictions would impact the 3 economies. So as I just mentioned, this particular study is centered on these 3 economies, and we are going to see the results of this study as we go along. So on this slide, I'd like to highlight that the number of IoT connections, and these are part of the findings of this study, the number of IoT connections is growing by almost 15% per year, and this is globally, and is set to reach approximately 25 billion connections by 2020. These are very encouraging statistics, and if you look at the power of IoT, it looks like it's going to revolutionize different economies in the region. But different economies are going to be impacted differently depending on the policies that are adopted in these countries. The sector that are very impacted by IoT play a crucial role in the emerging economies, and these sectors are agriculture, basic manufacturing, transport, logistics, health, and education, just to mention but a few. IoT has become a horizontal technology, and what we mean by this is that it is applicable in multiple sectors, and the uptake of IoT and related technology has a transformative impact on the way people live and how firms do business, meaning that IoT gains start to produce first and second order economic effects across the whole economy. So moving on to the next slide, and I'd like to quickly just talk about the benefits of IoT in the emerging markets. So in 2020, we witnessed the true power of digitization, and countries which had more developed ICT and digital infrastructure performed better in coping with the economic impact of COVID-19. Digitization promises to positively impact the way we live, work, and communicate. Governments in the region are currently focused on accelerating the adoption of digital services in order to boost growth of the digital economy. And the focus on the digital economy will lead to accelerated adoption of IoT in the region. Internet of Things is soon to transform businesses, energize communities and empower individuals. It can also benefit countries through increased productivity, employment, exports, energy efficiency, and of course the growth of GDP in the particular country. This is key as governments in the sub-Saharan Africa focus on economic recovery activities currently post-COVID-19 and look at how to sort of like boost the growth of their economies. And economically speaking, IoT will bring out cost reduction through efficiency gains and increased productivity flexibility. In addition, it will allow the shorter feedback loops between different production stages from design, prototyping, mass production, testing, and go-to-market. Overall, and in a nutshell, as highlighted on this slide, IoT will lead to increased productivity, enhanced energy or cost efficiencies, and lower environmental impact, because as we are looking, we need to more and more focus on the environmental impact of business or just our lives in the region. This contributes significantly to the growth of the digital economy and the GDP of our nation. And as mentioned in my previous slide, IoT has already become a horizontal technology impacting numerous economic sectors, including, as I had mentioned, manufacturing, agriculture, just to mention but a few. And specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, all these sectors are very key and play a very crucial role in driving economies of African countries. So it means that IoT promises a lot for us. Keeping in line with the impact of our data localization and restrictions of IoT gains, and if we can move to the next slide, we expect very significant gains of IoT, as I mentioned, and IoT depends on data and availability of data across borders. If data localization restrictions are imposed, these gains will not just be eroded slightly, but they will be halved or even worse in some instances. And just to look at what this particular slide is demonstrating, data localization requirements have been identified as potentially some of the most restrictive and disruptive barriers to international trade. And such requirements require foreign businesses to duplicate ICT infrastructure, such as data centers and computing facilities. And restrictions on ICT and telecom suppliers range from making cross-border data flows conditional on certain legal conditions, e.g. personal data protection, national security, or imposing data storage requirements. So maybe like copy of data must be stored locally, for example. And even on the local business, they will also be impacted, and particularly the SMEs, as they will not be able to find it difficult to participate in the international trade that has been promised by the new agreement in Africa. And in addition, data localization on industrial applications can undermine the business case of adopting IoT and related technologies. Not even the most profitable multinational enterprises can build data centers or run duplicate ICT infrastructure in every country they operate in. So this is a key concern that needs to be relooked at as we consider the issue of Pan-African trade and data protection across the continent. We hope that this kind of contribution to the debate will help focus our minds around the issues. And data localization restrictions can increase business costs through the need to duplicate expensive ICT infrastructure such as data centers, and cut business efficiencies and competitive advantage by imposing restrictions on cross-border data flows to hamper ICT and mobile operators as they move to introduce new and better services for our people. And of course, reduce the choice of businesses and the choice for business communities and individuals who will have access to more limited and lower quality applications and services and service delivered from a smaller pool of domestic providers. And if you're moving on to the next slide, and I'd like to drill down to some of the findings of the studies specifically in these three markets, so that is Brazil, Indonesia, and South Africa. Comparing the expected gains and the position after the hypothetical data localization restrictions are accounted for, we can see that the expected gains will reduce by over half in each case. So 59% for Brazil. So even before I look at that, so if you look at the role of IoT in the economy, so it looks like in Brazil the GDP would rise by 0.5%. Indonesia, it would rise by 0.9%, and South Africa will takes the lion's share in this particular study, and it would rise by 2.6%. But as I mentioned, the data localization restrictions would reduce by over half in each of these cases. So 59% for Brazil, 61% for Indonesia, and 68% for South Africa. And yes, I appreciate that we are looking at three specific countries, and you cannot automatically assume that they will be the same for each country. But the fact that the outcome is stark and roughly consistent across three very different economies in three different regions of the world should give a pause for thought to any government thinking of imposing or maintaining data localization restrictions. Moving on to the next slide, and so thought of highlighting very quickly, if we look at some of the findings of the report, so the contribution of IoT deployment in South Africa, for instance, and now that you're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, so I thought of just zeroing in on South Africa. So it looks like IoT would contribute significantly to the GDP. So 2%, it would contribute to exports, imports, consumption, investment, and of course employment, which is key. And a lot of countries are looking at improving employment in their countries. And if you look at the losses of data localization requirements on IoT in South Africa, so it has a negative impact on the GDP. So looking at minus 15%, and of course exports minus 14%. So these are huge impacts that can be avoided when you look at removing some of these restrictions that you are talking about. So this is a clear example of the impact of these data localizations in a market in Africa. And it's one of the reasons why we are sort of like having this discussion, so that we can be able to have recommendations that would be able to avoid such an impact. Next slide, please. And as I conclude, and keeping in line with the developments in the region, it is evident that data localization will be a great bottleneck in the Africa Continental Free Trade area. And it has the potential of slowing down the gains of the envisioned agreement. And if you look at this slide that I'm displaying, the report has conclusions from this particular study show that IoT enables different opportunities of growth for emerging economies, and this can be found to be consistent in all countries surveyed, despite being in different regions, industrial structures, and of course industrial policies. And the cost of imposing data localization measures and other similar restrictions on cross-border data flows that have similar cost-raising effect on to data localization requirements will only continue to rise further as data becomes increasingly important across areas of economic activity. So it's now is the time that we need to start relooking relooking these data localization requirements. This increased cost results in suppressed economic activity across the entire economy, with negative impacts not just to the GDP growth, but also to trade flows, employment, and investment in the region. And policymakers will need to reconsider the negative consequences of imposing data localization requirements and similar restrictions on cross-border data flows when developing data privacy policies in different countries in Africa. And to mitigate the impact of these measures, action needs to be limited to most essential policy objectives and to be imposed in a way that is minimally trade restrictive. And just in addition to that, policymakers, as I just mentioned, the policymakers and governments in the region need to rethink data localizations in order to unlock the full potential and the promise of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area in the region. And in addition, policymakers and business leaders cannot afford to be complacent, but need to start thinking very seriously about what steps they plan to take to facilitate and accelerate the adoption and implementation of IoT and related technology. And by the same token, they need to avoid measures that undermine the efficiency gains and cost savings that are promised by such technologies. And in particular, these data localization requirements and other restrictions on cross-border data flows should only be applied, as I mentioned before, when they are absolutely essential and implemented in a way that is minimally trade restrictive. Just in my conclusion, overall, the results shows that data localizations are similar, and similar restrictions on cross-border data flows can significantly cut into the efficiency gains, that can be seen in adopting IoT, and restrictions on cross-border data flows significantly raise the cost for business while lowering the profitability and tax revenue that the government would end up receiving when we see a boost in these particular different sectors. I'd like to pause there, and of course, I'm available to answer any questions that would come up on this. So I'd like to welcome the Data Protection Commissioner for Mauritius to take us through a quick presentation, and then we can pick up the poll after that. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I would seriously go straight in my presentation, not to lose time. So before I go on the slides, I would just like to make an introduction on what we believe cross-border data flows are, the importance of cross-border data flows. They have become a prerequisite for sound business strategies worldwide, as very elaborately described by the previous presenter. Now, to ignore the potential benefits of data sharing to a global data economy is a serious issue we have to avoid at all costs. A robust domestic policy drawing the fine balance between the benefits and risks of data flows is a must for both emerging market economies and highly developed market economies alike. The ambitious reputation to earn as a safe data destination for Africa is heavily reliant on securing the appropriate telecom infrastructure, respect for privacy and confidentiality, effective but targeted data localization requirements concerning local data storage, and sound trade policies, including data privacy requirements. Rigidity, in data processing laws across the world can only lead to the business world staying away from a particular territory, thus excluding a particular country from reality as it is now, that is, in a COVID world. The pressing need for Africa and other parts of the world to adopt interoperable policy frameworks, streamlining requirements across borders, and creating mechanisms to reduce regulatory overload is not happening as fast as we would like it to. This like-minded approach between countries is possible if our governments have the political will to achieve it. Our level of country-specific level preparedness has to be revisited as a matter of urgency. Now, a foundational truth, as we all know, is just a reflection. The world was created one, but we chose to build walls and barriers. Now the time has come to reassess the logic behind these walls. And I would not just right now go on my first slide, please. As you can see, I have inspired myself from this World Economic Forum document, where they have depicted a roadmap for cross-border data flows, which I find very appropriate. And the principles are like the 6 principles for the roadmap. First of all is allowing data to flow by default. Prohibit data localization, that has already been said. And second is establish a level of data protection which is appropriate. Establish national legal frameworks that protect the data of private individuals and complement this with laws that protect proprietary rights, intellectual proprietary rights. Third, prioritize cybersecurity. It's very important. Fourth is hardwire accountability between nations, establish effective cooperation mechanisms between national authorities to hold governments accountable for the security and confidentiality of the data they share, while making allowances for compliance. Fifth, prioritize connectivity, technical interoperability, data portability, and data provenance. Now, this is very important to prioritize the development of the connectivity infrastructure, which is a prerequisite to building a local data economy, and also encourage technical standards to increase interoperability, facilitating data portability at the B2B level to support SMEs, for example, and encourage data publishers to ensure data integrity. Six, future-proof the policy environment. Allow for the possibility of future alternative models, that is, certified learning models and data trusts that can also fulfill the spirit of cross-border data flows. And I would now go on to the slides 2 and 3. Slide 2 first. As you can see here, governments across the world have these concerns with regard to data localization requirements. And the fear, justified or not, about whether data will not be traveling safely to another destination, has made certain very important security concerns rise up. To start with, we have political, then going on to economic, cybersecurity, domestic security, environmental security, energy and natural resources security, and finally, essential infrastructure protection. So all these concerns have led to these data localization requirements being born. But the problem we know, as rightly pointed out, is that they have not stood the test of time. That is, whether they have been really concerns or just imaginary considerations that have been created. So it hasn't been proven yet as to how far these concerns are justified. So now we are thinking about making data localization more restricted so that free trade is not hampered, which is perfectly right to do it. So I would now go on to my third slide. So the one of the very important aspects that will really diminish the negative impacts of data localization is to establish a level of data protection appropriate in this particular scenario. And what does that mean? It means that we need, definitely, there is no choice, we need to have appropriate data protection laws, whether local, regional, international, and make it the right mix for every country to aspire to for enforcement. Second, that is, in all these legislations, cross-border transfers have to be catered for and permitted and allowed. Now, clear cooperation mechanisms are very important at the practical level to ensure that regulatory burdensome regulation is not hampering practical considerations. Now, compatibility or policy interoperability between data protection and privacy laws is also encouraged to ensure certainty and security in a region, for example, like Africa. All African countries having almost similar types of legislations promoting a common cause. Now, governments also, they have to investigate the possibility of reaching agreements, whatever form it takes, mutual agreements or bilateral agreements on the adequacy of other countries' data protection in a particular region like Africa, and developing an adequacy regime for a particular section, for a particular region, where actually these laws can be harmonized to a certain extent. And that will make a common space for the movement of personal data to be possible. Now, lawmakers, they have to encourage and secure data sharing and focus legislation and law enforcement on abuses as cybercrime, fraud, and harmful discrimination. This is also already the case in Mauritius. Now, in other parts of Africa, not really the case, but that should be the aim, the rationale behind cross-border data flows legislation. And if lawmakers now they enact broadly applicable privacy laws to define baselines, they should be technologically neutral so as to remain future-proof. And finally, on my next slide, please. As you can see, these are the basic data protection principles that everyone is aware of, and they are the core principles that have to be taken care of whilst developing these frameworks. So I would not be going on detail in this particular slide. I will just continue on my discussion. As you know, we all know that there is no such thing, as I said, as an ideal harmonized set of laws applicable in the global context. Indeed, we are all striving to reach that level of perfection, which is not reality yet, given our differences. So existing legal and trade frameworks are inspired from existing principles, which are divergent and varied in many local contexts, leading to multiple different principles which may not be effective altogether. They are called upon to be reviewed often, which is not the case now, as they do not keep pace with fast evolving digital economies. Because of the complexities and incredible time factor involved in making such efficient frameworks, the solution lies in trade agreements which incorporate all the legally sound conditions, including data privacy, to allow cross-border data flows to happen, and data localization requirements thus do not then become a barrier to ensuring free trade. There is indeed a very wrong perception about data protection being a country-specific or region-specific issue. It is a global concern which necessitates global action. Unfortunately, current frameworks are not being able to ensure that enforcement of data protection international principles can take place anywhere in the world. For example, if Africa develops a common data space or a digital single market with a revised version of the Malabo Convention and appropriate trade agreements, as it is doing right now, it will need the African court to be able to adjudicate violations of them. The more practical we get with standards, the more positive the outcome we will see. All the foundations have been laid in Africa: the Continental Free Trade Agreement, the Malabo Convention, the regional agreements at the levels of ECOWAS, COMESA SADC, the AU project on harmonization of data protection laws in Africa. What remains is the right understanding and equilibrium between protection of data and promotion of trade. The EU GDPR, for example, has tried to make enforcement meaningful by applying the extraterritoriality strategy. However, overly broad and strict requirements on data flows with regard to equivalence of third countries have to be smoothened to allow prosperity. Otherwise, what we will see as a result of those strict conditions in the near future are economic blocks around regional sovereignty, making cooperation amongst nations even more difficult. What I mean is we should therefore aim for a global market and not geographical blocks, as data is global and will remain so. Thank you so much. I hope that I have been within the time limits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rudisha, and apologies earlier, I lost my connection right before the presentation started. Thank you very much once again, Rudisha, for that very insightful submission. The presentation is going to come from our good friend with Ericsson, Ammar Sabag. He's the head of technology and IoT with Ericsson. In his current role, Ammar drives Ericsson's strategy and business development for IoT solutions for cities. Does quite a lot of coordination around creating ICT and IoT solutions and applications that have to do with smart cities and smart communities, smart energy, smart mobility, and so on and so forth. So he does bring a wealth of experience from the IoT space and real-life applications of these sorts of solutions as well. So I'm looking forward to listening to Ammar. Ammar?
Hey everyone, thank you for the introduction. I did not prepare a presentation. The idea is to give our view as Ericsson and based on our experience globally and in Africa. So just wanted to mention three basic principles really about IoT. Appreciate the discussion that's going so far. Our principles are IoT is a global business, not a local business. Because it crosses borders, it's going and it's growing beyond a local city or a local country. The second thing, ecosystem is major player in IoT. So it's you cannot have an IoT running standalone. You really need to have a lot of partners, and it's an ecosystem play. It's not a solution that you just grow. Because again, IoT is a global business, and I will touch on that in a minute. And for IoT to scale, you really need to have global connectivity and managed connectivity. The idea here is you could really have, I mean, we've seen countries that they are running 10,000 to 100,000 connections. But when you reach the million connection and the 3 million, you cannot do it. You have to have really a global connectivity, and it's managed. So those are the three principles. I'm just going to take it into three layers. We have the devices and the enterprises that use that. We have the IoT data, and we have the application. So on the devices, enterprises and device manufacturers, the OEMs, they are now creating the devices. They are born connected. So they have the bootstrap, they have the eSIM already embedded, and they are shipping them around the world. So it's hard for a country to say, no. I mean, you have to have my local IoT. IoT business is now global. I worked in smart cities, and yes, we used to do smart lighting, and that's at the beginning we thought it's a city business, but not really true, because to have the analytics and to have the comparison between the lighting usage in this compared to others. It has just showed South Africa to Brazil. You really need to have a global connectivity and global data access. So then you can compare the patterns and what's going on across. So those devices that are being produced, whether for agriculture, farming, whether for manufacturing, vehicles. I mean, I was in a conference talking about connected vehicle. Connected vehicle is not one connected device. It's like 100 connected devices. The tires, the batteries, the windshield, the wipers, the lights, everything is connected. The engine is connected. And all of them are should go back to the manufacturer to see the behavior of the car. So again, with the masses of connected devices, those need to be verified. They need to be tested for security, for compliance. We have standard we follow with GSMA, the 3GPP, and others. And then they are shipped globally, those devices, to every country in the world. I mean, I talked to some countries, and they are not aware of some of the connected devices that are already running on their network. And they have hundreds of thousands. And they are like, okay, they are roaming. No. Yes, they are roaming, but you really need to have, your own managed devices so they come to your own platform so you can monetize it better and manage it better. So the data is being already, the devices cross borders, the data are going cross borders. Sorry to say whether we like it or not, but they are happening. So it's what we recommend as a way forward is really to work with a global connected providers, for the operators, that they bring the ecosystems, they bring the devices, and you are part of this whole ecosystems. I mean, one example, when we have our annual IoT community, we have like 6,000 enterprises on our platform. We have 100 operators on our platforms, and everybody is happy because the device will be verified on a globally standard platform, and the operators is generating money and having access to the data that's required and having an influence on what data goes outside the country and what data stays in the country. The last thing I want to mention, with our IoT, we put a security layer, which is now a major part of all IoT. And the idea here is the data that's really, there is some confusion sometimes. We hear it from some of the customers. They think about IoT devices like mobile devices or subscriber devices, and they are not the same. Because a mobile device, you have the subscriber data, the information, who is who, the ID, the location of that person. So that's why it's critical. Whereas with the IoT data, what goes outside the country, and that should be permitted, is the device characteristics. What's the device behavior? What are the data that they are collecting about a certain thing? And examples for that is how many times you hit the brakes, how many times you switch the light on and off. And these are the data that really need to be going across. For Africa to really accelerate on the IoT I would say, look at the UAE model here, what they have done. UAE has maybe around 2 million connected devices. And what they have done is they have done data categorization. So they divided the data into like mission critical data, which is like the national security. I saw in the poll, people are voting for national interest and national security. Yes, so you don't want to transfer the data of maybe utility or the data of military related assets. But the data are already coming and going inside the country. Some data like Uber or Google, they have the data and they are collecting it from our devices, and they know more about the traffic in Addis Ababa than Addis Ababa city municipality, because they collected this information from the users. And that's not a problem. The problem is you really need to have categorization of data and collaborating with those global players. And that's why I refer to the ecosystem partners and saying, like, we like to access this data, we like to regulate, and we like to open trade. So let's go again back to the African continent. And I don't like that, but let's go to South Africa or Nigeria or Ethiopia. If you want to have assets tracking or fleet management use cases or logistics, which is very important these days, whether it's a port, you really need to have an open data and have the data across the border so you can track things across the border. So I'm not saying that you have to have totally open data. You could have some categorization of data, but I would say 80 to 90% of the data has to be open for cross borders and to develop that market and to help the operator to monetize these data. Because those global companies, they might have interest in one or two use cases, but the city or the country has multiple usage of this. So I would say collaboration is very important, and it is a global business. It's not a local business. So we've seen some operators building their own M2M platform. Yeah, you reach a limit. And when we bring all the car manufacturer, all the medical devices that are connected, you cannot handle them. You really need to have, the proper global platform. And if you don't have it, your competitor will have it. And if both don't have it, they will skip the country, the enterprises and OEM, because the business has already moved to the connectivity and to IoT. So I hope I made my points clear. If you have questions, please let me know, and I'll be on a panel for any more questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ammar. Our next brief comments are going to come from Ronke Oyetunde. Ronke has been with MTN for many, many years now and brings with her a wealth of experience from operating in the regulatory space across the sub-Saharan Africa region. She's the General Manager for Regulatory Affairs with MTN Group. Ronke, please.
It is my honor and pleasure to actually participate in this particular webinar. I think for us it's very, very topical because it strikes at the core of the next cusp in terms of the development and growth of the ICT and telecoms industry in the next few years. I'll be addressing two major issues. The first is why cross-border data flows matter to us as mobile operators, and two, what do we want to see within the ecosystem in terms of how this is addressed from a regulatory and policy perspective. First of all, I'll just start with something we all know, the movement of data between jurisdictions for various purposes without restrictions is a critical factor to ensuring the success of country aspirations with regard to digital transformation, digitization, 4IR, international trade and commerce. It is an integral part of it, and for that reason, I think it's something which it should be treated as a front burner issues by countries, and we're very happy to hear what our regulator in Mauritius is actually doing. We are very excited also as operators with the coming into effect of the African Continental Free Trade Area on the 1st of January 2021, because what this says is that it points everybody in the right direction. Number one, we need a single liberalized market in Africa. And by this particular agreement and arrangement, we can achieve it. It also promotes the free movement of capital and people and the free flow and access to goods and services. That's what it says in the Africa Free Trade Zone agreement. However, the goods and services, as far as we're concerned, an integral part of that is ICT services, telecom services across borders. So as MTN, we are very, very proud to have contributed substantially to the growth of the mobile and digital market in Africa, delivery of mobile telephony services and digital subscriptions in Africa. And as a result of, we currently have operations in 17 African countries, having commenced in 1994. And we have a core belief that everyone in Africa, every African deserves the benefit of a modern, connected life. It is therefore our mission in MTN to make our customers' lives a whole lot brighter. And we cannot do that without that extra element of having that free flow of data across borders. In order to achieve our goals, it is critical that we're able to capitalize on efficiencies arising from centralization and virtualization, particularly as we have a global business covering a number of African countries. It is to the benefit of countries. It is to the benefit of economies in which we operate. It is to the benefit of subscribers that we're able to capitalize on that centralization, maybe by way of cloud services, by way of pooling and harmonizing services across the board. And we can't do that if we cannot transmit data across borders. It's particularly a concern, not just for product offerings, but for also our ability to deliver services to our customers. So for example, we have a lot of multinationals who maybe want a single data center or a cloud service within the MTN ecosystem. We are unable to deliver it at this time. Our ability to deliver it at this time is fragmented because of the various local laws that we need to comply with in various countries and the varying degrees of success we achieve when we apply. In certain countries, we're not allowed to. There is a total ban on cross-border data services. In some countries, there are regulatory prescriptions to apply for regulatory approval for such cross-border activity, but getting it can be a very uphill task. Very often we have to expose very sensitive information to the regulators, etc., in order to get the approvals we need. And it can be convoluted. Sometimes it takes years. It could take up to 12 months or more just to get the approvals. And say, for example, the deployment of a cloud service, maybe for the provision of mobile financial services across the MTN ecosystem, is being hampered by the fragmented regulatory regimes we have. So we have a lot to benefit where we can have that harmonized approach across the board, across African countries. We would like to enjoy the kind of benefits that the EU have in this particular space. EU countries have in terms of cross-border data flows within their ecosystem. The same thing also exists in Asian countries. We want to be able to benefit from that. So we would definitely be advocating. We are definitely strongly advocating for this, for that harmonization to take place. I also want to mention that operators are at the forefront of emerging IoT, AI, and automation advancements, as my colleague from Ericsson has said. And for us, it is critical for us to be able to have that pooling of resources across the board to ensure that the requisite economies of scale and efficiencies flow through to subscribers in the various countries in which we operate. Also, the key thing for us at this time is that the current restrictions on data flow, on the flow of traffic between our operations, puts us as telcos at a major disadvantage when compared with unregulated service providers who provide similar services, you know, the OTTs, for example. And for us, it's a major issue of concern. Also, the constraints impose, also the restrictions impose constraints on our ability to serve our over 250 million subscribers across the board. We have a substantial number of subscribers, and where we're not able to deliver services efficiently to them, it is a major concern. There are so many savings we could bring to bear as a result of that free flow of traffic, but we can't do it because we're being forced by the current regime to have several cloud services, localized cloud service in many countries, rather than a single one, which will serve all our customers across the board. Also, we find that the restrictions, I don't need to hone in on the reasons why. We know that the restrictions are fueled by concerns such as data privacy and security requirements, national security concerns, and promoting national economies. But we feel that the benefits of having a global reach probably far outweigh the promotion of national economies. And that's why the Africa Continental Free Trade arrangement is key. And we need to make sure that we buttress it with that free flow of traffic across the board. What do we want as operators? I think for us, the primary thing that we would ask very selfishly is where we have multinationals such as MTN, we should be able to have free flow of traffic within our global ecosystem. It will help. We currently have, non-sensitive information is already passing, across the board. We don't see any reason why we can't extend that to sensitive data, particularly where we ensure that we put in the requisite protection for data privacy, and also security concerns, things like encryption. If we're able to do that, I think we would have won the race. I just want to refer everybody, since we're dealing with Africa, to the Africa Union's transformation strategy for Africa, 2020 to 2030. It says Africa presents a sea of economic opportunities in virtually every sector, and the continent's youthful population structure is an enormous opportunity in this digital era, and hence the need for Africa to make digitally enabled socio-economic development a high priority. Part and parcel of that digitally enabled socio-economic development is the cross-border data flow and relaxing data sovereignty requirements within the African continent. We also need, and we obviously already have within our ecosystem. Sorry, before I even go there to the point I wanted to make, I just want to say that there are mechanisms in the world we can emulate, such as the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Cross-Border Privacy Rule System, where they have a very good harmonized balance within amongst participating countries, and they're able to balance the legitimate needs to protect confidential information with the free flow of traffic that promotes economic development, digital transformation. Also, I just want to mention the fact that we believe that we already have the requisite mechanisms that can be adopted within our ecosystem, such as, say, for example, the various, number one, the Malabo Convention is there. We can leverage on that, build on that to ensure that cross-border, it doesn't address cross-border data flows, but we can extend it to implementing the roadmap for cross-border data flows within that convention, or within that body of the global body of convention that governs the African continent. There are also similar models in the ECOWAS region, in Southern Africa, and in East Africa that we can leverage on. So it's not that we're operating in a vacuum. There are things that we can leverage on to lead us to where we need to go. Preconditions, operators will be happy. Sorry, I'll just close with one point.
Okay, I just wanted to note. All right, thank you very much. Yeah, we're running behind schedule.
One point, that the last point I want to make is the fact that operators are very keen to support the implementation of any roadmap within the African continent that will promote cross-border data flows. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much for that very detailed submission, Ronke. I'm sure there will be quite a number of questions probably that will come your way during the panel session, and also from the participants to this webinar. Our next presenter, or our next submission, is going to come from a good friend from Smart Africa, Thelma Kwe. Thelma is the head of digital infrastructure program with Smart Africa, and Thelma will be sharing some thoughts with us for the next few minutes ahead of us getting into the panel discussion. Thelma?
Thank you, and good afternoon from Kigali, and Happy New Year to everyone on this call. Briefly, just to introduce what Smart Africa is. Smart Africa is a pan-African organization working together with countries across Africa to create the single digital market. And this is being done under the leadership of the heads of states of the various countries, chaired by His Excellency Paul Kagame, and the President of the President of Rwanda. Currently, our membership spans 31 countries in Africa and about 64 private and international organizations, which includes the GSMA and MTN. So to go straight to today's topic, I believe my fellow panel members have spoken a lot, and I'm in total agreement with most of what has been said. I'm going to touch a bit on the direction of policy across Africa because of where I sit regarding data protection and cross-border data flows. I'm also going to touch a bit on Smart Africa's goals, what we want to do, and how they align to all the other rules and regulations or other initiatives And then I'm also going to touch on cross-border data flows and the situation, the landscape of cross-border data flows in Africa. The reason is that I believe, the reason I want to start from data protection, privacy laws and regulation across Africa is I believe that the basis of a good cross-border data flow mechanism is a good data protection and privacy law or regulation. If we don't have the law, then we don't even talk about how we can effectively and efficiently move data across. So first on your screen, you would see the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Data Protection, which Oyeronke had mentioned. So this is the regulation that has been put in place by the African Union. It was put in place in 2014, and up until now, we have 14 countries only that have signed. And this is something that as Smart Africa, we have also taken together with our colleagues from GSMA and other persons that I see on this call to be able to work to make sure that either we are doing an improved version of the Malabo Convention or also support it. Even though loosely, very loosely, the Malabo Convention talks about cross-border data flows, we believe that there's some sort of enhancement that has to be done. So this is to show you on a regional level what we have. Now, next slide, please. So the next slide shows what we have in the various blocks of regions. So for instance, we have the ECOWAS Supplementary Act, then we have the SADC Model Law. So we are not operating in a vacuum, we have all these available. And then finally, the next slide, please. I'm trying to stay within time because I think we are really behind time. Okay, now this shows the status of countries that have data protection at a national level. So as at the time that we put this together, we had 30 countries that have specific data protection laws, and 8 were in the process and 16 did not have any at all. Now, when we were also doing this, we realized that even for those who have the data protection laws, a lot of them are not autonomous. When you go to the countries, yes, they may say they have the law, but the people to implement it or to effect it are not autonomous. Now, you would agree that if we have to have an effective data protection law, a result of which we are going to have a very good cross-border data flow, we need to have autonomous data protection authorities in the countries. Now, this is one key problem. Also, in terms of capacity, we need to be able to capacitate these officers at the country level to be able to carry out properly their mandate. So, next, please. Please go to the next. Now, another thing that I wanted to touch on today, which is in relation, or it's a basis for us to get a good cross-border data flow, is to see what is the temperature of the countries when it comes to the rights of the subject. How do countries view the access to data by the subject? So we see that largely a lot of the countries just give the subject the rights to the data. Well, a number of the countries also give them access to be able to rectify or even to erase their personal data. That is the right to be forgotten. But largely, if you look at a continent of 55 countries, and we have only 20 countries that are effectively pushing this agenda, you can see that we have quite a lot of work to do. So this is just to set the tone and the baseline and to give you an overview of data protection and how different countries view it. But then when it comes to cross-border data, it's also a different story. And I think it has been elaborated time and time again by my previous colleagues. At the time we did this data, which was just last year, only 2 countries only 2 countries allowed had no restriction for cross-border data flows. Now, if we are going to be doing the free trade bloc, this is a no-brainer. We need to be able to encourage free transfer of data as well. The few countries, about 26 countries that had the ability for you to move data across, also becomes very, very bureaucratic. And so it makes it almost impossible for you to be able to be efficient when you need to use data across borders. And now when we talk about it in relation to IoT, in relation to, let's say, even MTN's operations, just as Oyerenke has said, it becomes very inefficient if for every time you have to transfer data across borders, you need to go through very, very bureaucratic processes, or even some countries do not allow it at all. Now, what we want to do, if you can please go to the next slide. What do we want to do? We want to be able to create, first of all, a harmonized framework. You would see that we have the regional bodies having the regulation. We have the AUC regulation, which we also allude to. We have countries that have their different frameworks based on different concepts. Now, what we want to do is not to create a new Malabo Convention, but to define a framework that will support the countries. Now, this is something that we are doing together with the working group, of which GSMA is part of. We want to be able to educate our countries, first of all, to be at ease. Now, one of the issues that we found out in the working group is that a lot of these countries, of course, is national security issue. Also, they feel like it's an infringement on their sovereign rights. A lot of them also have not come to appreciate the need for cross-border data flows in order to aid digital transformation. So this is something that we need to handhold the regulators. We need to capacitate them. And so one of the things that we have also done at Smart Africa is to create, together with UNECA, the Africa Data Leadership Initiative, where we are going to be creating peer learning groups amongst the countries to be able to, bit by bit, educate them on the need for some of these things. And actually, it even goes beyond just cross-border data. We are looking at data governance in general. What is the data economy that is coming up that we can take advantage of? Well, cross-border data becomes part of it. But then how can we also use data for proper decision making? How do we use data for our advantage? How do we disabuse that mindset that thinks that data privacy is all about keeping or closing in on my data? So these are some of the things that we want to be working on together with the working group and the platform that we have created. Now, to the next slide, please. What would be the benefits? Why are we pushing so much for this? Of course, a harmonized framework would mean a better bargaining power. I heard my colleagues talking about the big giants that already hold our data, the Googles of this world. I mean, Google negotiating on a country level is too much logistically. But also the country also does not have that leverage in terms of numbers to be able to negotiate with Google. So we think that if we have a harmonized framework, we all sing from the same hymn book, and then we are able, even if we are doing it individually, Google sees that we are all speaking the same language and we are in for the better of both of us. Why do we again need cross-border data? We can see the immediate benefit of scale by businesses. If you allow data going around, I mean, somebody in Niger who has a data center, for instance, could be storing somebody's data from Rwanda. And that's all contributing to the GDP of Africa as a whole. So we move from the national level to an African level, to a Pan-African level, which has already been initiated by the Free Trade Agreement. Again, the third one I want to add is the easy adaptability of new technology. Whether we like it or not, our data is being shared anyway. We just need to find a way of regulating it. And if we now institutionalize the way of regulating it, it's going to help us easily adapt to the emerging technology. Now, I saw in the Q&A somebody asking, why are we chasing IoT now when people don't even have phones, people don't have connectivity? While we are working on the connectivity, we are working with infrastructure providers that are creating the connectivity, working on how we can have new financing models to handle the other half that has not been connected. We are working on digital skills, improving the digital skills for Africans. But if we don't start working now on emerging technologies like IoT, 5 years down the line, we'll still be struggling like we are struggling with connectivity. And so there's the need to put attention on IoT, artificial intelligence, big data at this point, and create that bridge and be able to regulate it properly so that we don't fall behind every time as Africa. So in a nutshell, we at Smart Africa are very much in alignment with the need to encourage cross-border data flow, but in a very, very balanced and efficient way. We acknowledge the fears of or the reasons that are being given by our government, but in our way, we want to be able to balance, find a balance between the need to support the free circulation of data, database value creation on the one hand, and also the need to protect our citizens and the state's interest, whilst also ensuring that we are not left behind in the emerging technologies. So thank you very much, Kamal. Over to you. I hope I made it in good time.
Very much, Thelma. And just to mention that our poll is now going to be closing shortly. And whilst we go into the panel discussion, that is going to be moderated by my colleague from the GSMA, who's the Director of Privacy, Boris Reuter. Boris, please.
Just start with the poll questions because we have some responses there. And the first question you remember is when can data localization restrictions ever really be justified? And the majority here, yes, kind of the majority answered national security. Some were saying maybe for certain types of data, and some were saying never. I think it's interesting that no one was replying that it's for the economy, because that is perhaps the biggest sort of red herring, if you like, that it doesn't really protect economies if you try to localize and sort of protect your economy in that way. And everyone understands national security. The second question was a very straight and unfair choice of which statement you prefer. Cross-border data flows should be allowed as much as possible. Well, the vast majority were in favor of that. But interestingly, it's interesting that there are some people who do think cross-border data flows should be controlled tightly, which explains maybe why we do see some data localization requirements still being maintained or introduced. Let me start, invite our panelists to turn on their videos if they haven't already. And just before I ask a couple of questions in the small time we have left, let me also just really emphasize something that's very important, that while we're talking a lot about the economy in this discussion today, and in fact that's the sort of focus of our study, none of this makes any sense if we don't design human rights and privacy into all our thinking, whether it's at the level of law, or at the level of company operational matters, because without that we're just on a slippery slope to just purely maximizing the revenues and so on. So let me just ask two quick questions because we don't have much time. So first of all, just to explore a little bit more the relationship between trade agreements and data protection and cross-border data flows. perhaps maybe Ronke, I could start with you on this. We hear a lot about RCEP, that trade agreement in the East, the African Free Trade Area, the European Union. All these trade agreements are bringing in data flow language into that. Someone was pointing out on the question chat about the second phase of the Continental Free Trade Area that will bring that in. But do you see that as a catalyst for data protection to be aligned and accelerated across the continent, or do you see it actually as something that doesn't quite take account of data protection because it's just encouraging data flows, but it doesn't always mention human rights or privacy so much? It's more just about the trade aspect.
I think the first point I want to make is definitely, I totally agree with the fact that we need to have very, well, not too robust, but the baseline of data privacy in all countries in which we operate, in all African countries. And I think the Malabo Convention, the regional models provide the premise and the basis for introducing the national laws that protect digital human rights as well as confidential information. That being said, premised on that, I don't see how we can implement a regime such as the African Continental Free Trade Agreement or other such agreements without addressing issues such as cross-border data flows as well as data privacy. It cannot be done. That, in my own opinion, cannot be done. We must protect our people and we must enhance the free flow of information across borders in order to achieve the goals of such agreements. You can't do it without it. That's the way I see it. I think I'll stop there since we.
Yeah, sure. And as just a quick follow-on to that, for Judisha and possibly Thelma, if you want to, one of the questions that came up was, what do you think about cross-border cooperation and enforcement of data protection authorities? Is that strong enough? Is Convention 108 providing that kind of trust between authorities, or do we need to do something else?
Definitely, Convention 108 is, yes, thank you so much. Definitely, Convention 108 is a very good starting point with regard to, facilitating cross-border data flows. But as I said, it's just a starting point. And the development from that is, as my previous colleague has also stated, trade agreements. Trade agreements with the right data protection and human rights considerations incorporated is actually key. Because, Convention 108 is, as any international document, international convention, including regional conventions, they address the issues from a holistic perspective. And what we need in this context is practical considerations that have to be incorporated, which are also country specific. I mean, respecting the country's requirements. And that can only be done in trade agreements. And that is why I'm so much in favor, because at the level of the office, we have advised on many such trade agreements where we have incorporated data protection clauses in these agreements. And I must say that this right combination is making our task so easy, because we actually are helping in this way for cross-border enforcement and cooperation. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. And just to add to that, there's a WTO initiative at the moment called the Joint Statement Initiative that is also looking at these trade flows and data flows. I'm going to ask the last question to Thelma. What do you think can be done? You sort of hinted at this in your presentation, but we need to drive an acceleration of the pace of adoption of data protection laws in Africa, and there's sort of a reluctance there or a hesitancy. And what is driving that, and what could we do to make that go a bit faster? What are the policy issues?
Okay, thank you very much. So in terms of policy and regulation, I think, as I said, we are not operating in vacuum. We have quite a number. We have the Malabo Convention, we have the Convention 108, we have the regional ones, we have country level. I believe, and in our interaction with the data protection authorities, what we need to do is to capacitate them to be autonomous to enforce, because enforcement is a big deal. Enforcement hasn't been happening very much. And then we also need to help them in terms of operationalization. But most importantly, I believe that the learning or peer learning network that we are trying to implement would also bring that change that we want to drive us towards the cross-border data flows. So these are the three things that I think we should do. We need to enable them to be autonomous. We need to capacitate them, and then we need it's a work in progress. We need to help them based on the peer learning network, bring different countries together, they learn from each other, and then we can move together in one direction. So this is what I think we can do.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that brief answer. And let me now just wrap up, because I think we have to draw this to a close. But I think we've heard today from all our speakers, from Wale onwards, that there are several components to this. There's the trade angle, there's the data protection and human rights angle, and of course there's the technology angle, and all of these drive in their different ways. None of them is quite perfect, but they all influence each other, and somehow we need to all keep talking to each other to make sure we're pushing together in the same direction, so that we have a system that's fair and generates good outcomes for all citizens, all consumers, and governments too. So thank you very much to all our panelists, and thank you very much to the audience for joining us on this webinar, and hopefully we'll engage with you again very soon.